Good afternoon. So for Belmont, got to say afternoon because it's just after class. Promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural safety. Hope we can get that out to you ASAP. I've already sent out the communications one today. So without further ado, where we went with our first video, I finished with the cultural safety, cultural awareness and cultural competence sort of information. So that took us through to question 4, which was, I'll just read it out. In relation to historical, social, political and economic issues listed below, respond to the following. A, for each issue below, describe the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people, and B, describe the implication of these issues for engagement with community services and health systems. So Australia Day, Invasion Day. So he kind of gives a nice snapshot on his perspective from his family, some of his immediate family ancestors, as well as other significant events in Australia. And it sets a really nice little grab or a snapshot for us to think about these issues. So in fact, what I should say is when you're listening to this shortish speech by Stan, not too long, but take some notes of he goes through the events. So that'd be good. Over to you, Stan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming along this evening, and I would also like to extend my respects to my Gadigal brothers and sisters from my people, the Wiradjuri people. In the winter of 2015, Australia turned to face itself. It looked into its soul and it had to ask this question: who are we? What sort of country do we want to be? And this happened in a place that is most holy, most sacred to Australians. It happened in the sporting field. It happened on the football field. Suddenly the front page was on the back page. It was in the grandstands. Thousands of voices rose to hound an Indigenous man, a man who was told he was an Australian, a man who was told he was an Australian of the Year. And they hounded that man into submission. I can't speak for what lay in the hearts of the people who booed Adam Goodes, but I can tell you what we heard when we heard those boos. We heard a sound that was very familiar to us. We heard a howl. We heard a howl of humiliation that echoes across 2 centuries of dispossession, injustice, suffering and survival. We heard the howl of the Australian dream, and it said to us again, you're not welcome. The Australian dream. We sing of it and we recite it in verse. Australians all, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. My people die young in this country. We die 10 years younger than average Australians, and we are far from free. We are fewer than 3% of the Australian population, and yet we are 25%, a quarter of those Australians, locked up in our prisons. And if you are a juvenile, it is worse, it is 50%. An Indigenous child is more likely to be locked up in prison than they are to finish high school. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges. Reminds me that my people were killed on those plains. We were shot on those plains. Disease ravaged us on those plains. I come from those plains. I come from a people west of the Blue Mountains, the Wiradjuri people, where in the 1820s the soldiers and settlers waged a war of extermination against my people. Yes, a war of extermination. That was the language used at the time. Go to the Sydney Gazette and look it up and read about it. Martial law was declared and my people could be shot on sight. Those rugged mountain ranges, my people, women and children, were herded over those ranges to their deaths. The Australian dream. The Australian dream is rooted in racism. It is the very foundation of the dream. It is there at the birth of the nation. It is there in terra nullius, an empty land, a land for the taking. 60,000 years of occupation. A people who made the first seafaring journey in the history of mankind. A people of law, a people of lore, L-O-R-E, a people of music and art and dance and politics. None of it mattered. because our rights were extinguished because we were not here according to British law. And when British people looked at us, they saw something subhuman, and if we were human at all, we occupied the lowest rung on civilization's ladder. We were fly-blown Stone Age savages, and that was the language that was used. Charles Dickens, the great writer of the age, when referring to the noble savage of which we were counted among, said it would be better that they be wiped off the face of the earth. Captain Arthur Phillip, a man of enlightenment, a man who was instructed to make peace with the so-called natives in a matter of years, was sending out raiding parties with the instruction, bring back the severed heads of the black troublemakers. They were smoothing the dying pillow. My people were rounded up and put on missions from where, if you escaped, you were hunted down, you were roped and tied and dragged back, and it happened here. It happened on the mission that my grandmother and my great-grandmother are from at Warrengesda on the Darling Point at the Murrumbidgee River. Read about it. It happened. By 1901, when we became a nation, when we federated the colonies, we were nowhere. We're not in the Constitution, save for race provisions, which allowed for laws to be made that would take our children, that would invade our privacy, that would tell us who we could marry and tell us where we could live, the Australian dream. By 1963, the year of my birth, the dispossession was continuing. Police came at gunpoint, under cover of darkness, to Mapoon, an Aboriginal community in Queensland, and they ordered people from their homes, and they burned those homes to the ground, and they gave the land to a bauxite mining company, and today those people remember that as the night of the burning. In 1963, when I was born, I was counted among the flora and fauna, not among the citizens of this country. Now, you will hear things tonight, you will hear people say, but you've done well. Yes, I have. And I'm proud of it. And why have I done well? I've done well because of who has come before me. My father, who lost the tips of 3 fingers working in sawmills to put food on our table because he was denied an education. My grandfather, who served to fight wars for this country when he was not yet a citizen and came back to a segregated land where he couldn't even share a drink with his digger mates in the pub because he was black. My great-grandfather, who was jailed for speaking his language to his grandson, my father, jailed for it. My grandfather on my mother's side, who married a white woman who reached out to Australia, lived on the fringes of town until the police came, put a gun to his head, bulldozed his tin humpy, and ran over the graves of the 3 children he buried there. That's the Australian dream. I have succeeded in spite of the Australian dream, not because of it, and I have succeeded because of those people. You might hear tonight, but you have white blood in you. And if the white blood in me was here tonight, my grandmother, she would tell you of how she was turned away from a hospital giving birth to her first child because she was giving birth to the child of a black person. The Australian dream. We're better than this. I have seen the worst of the world as a reporter. I spent a decade in war zones from Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are an extraordinary country. We are in so many respects the envy of the world. If I was sitting here where my friends are tonight, I would be arguing passionately for this country. But I stand here with my ancestors and the view looks very different from where I stand. The Australian dream. We have our heroes. Albert Namatjira painted the soul of this nation. Vincent Lingiari put his hand out for Gough Whitlam to pour the sand of his country through his fingers and say, this is my country. Kathy Freeman lit the torch to the Olympic Games, but every time we are lured into the light, we are mugged by the darkness of this country's history. Of course racism is killing the Australian dream. It is self-evident that it's killing the Australian dream. But we are better than that. The people who stood up and supported Adam Goodes and said no more, they are better than that. The people who marched across the bridge for reconciliation, they are better than that. The people who supported Kevin Rudd when he said sorry to the stolen generations, they are better than that. My children and their non-Indigenous friends are better than that. My wife, who is non-Indigenous, is better than that. And one day I want to stand here and be able to say as proudly and sing as loudly as anyone else in this room, Australians all, let us rejoice. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Stan. So, just in summary, some of the things he spoke about was in more recent times we had the Australian rules footballer Adam Goodes, who was basically booed into retirement, attacked around issue of being Indigenous, excuse me, attacked about around being an Indigenous person. He kept coming back to the lyrics of Advance Australia Fair, and there's that whole debate around our national anthem about is that a true representation of all peoples in this country. He talks about the wars on the Western Plains of New South Wales in the 1820s, the War of Extermination, and martial law, and that whole invasion. And I spoke about the use of the word invasion rather than the word settlement that's used in the assignment. But, you know, around that idea that terra nullius, an empty land, that disregarded that 60,000 years at least of law, L-O-R-E, that's a law in that context for Aboriginal Australia is the interrelationship between people, the land, customs, whether it be ingrained in music, art, dance, and the political systems. British scholars, important people, authors of the day, labelling Aboriginal people as subhuman. And 1900, Australia gets the Constitution and Federation, no mention of Aboriginal people. 1963, the year of Stan Grant's birth, he gave the example of a town in Queensland that was dispossessed and buried and burnt and knocked to the ground for mining purposes. No regard for the people. And in 63, the year of his birth, Stan Grant was still considered among the flora and fauna. He spoke about the work ethic of his grandfather denied an education, jailed for using language, bulldozed his humpy. Some of the achievements, like Vincent Linyari, who's captured in that song From Little Things Big Things Grow, and the handing over of the Gurindji land by Gough Whitlam in the 70s. But if we look at that assignment, so the impact on Aboriginal people, that loss of land and culture, and then the impact on engagement with the community services sector. So loss of land and culture, what does that impact? So Stan really goes through that, but dispossession from land, loss of culture, loss of law, loss of identity in a sense, the wars, the disease, loss of numbers, loss of health when you're losing your traditional food sources, that's being replaced with highly processed foods like flour that was paid perhaps in rations for unpaid work. I guess you're losing that sense of connection and culture and land and identity. The impact and engagement on health and community services. So we looked at that as being broad, but all those European or English-based systems, whether it be government, policing, hospitals. And so I guess the way that Aboriginal people would see them, they were the perpetrators of the dispossession, if you like. Anything that connected to the government, policing, laws, things like that. They're engaged in they're the enemy. So, there would certainly be fear, lack of desire to engage perhaps. Maybe there was engagement, maybe that was met with violence. Violence, the other engagement I guess would be a violent retaliation, that guerrilla warfare. That's maybe the initial engagements. European settlement. So I would get rid of the word European settlement. I'd call it invasion, and we'll have a look at what Briggs says about that shortly. Aboriginal, the hip-hop artist, he's done a song around Australia Day and the anthem. But yeah, the impact on that settlement, again, the Western Plains of New South Wales is a really good example, as around closer to Sydney than Hawkesbury, but the impact of harder hoofed animals on traditional food sources, whether they be yams or native grasses that would be turned into a more or less a bread. Straight away they'd be lost to the hard-hoofed animals and the farming practices, turning, in a sense, a fertile land to quite a different landscape. And when I say a fertile land, there's a lot of evidence from Bruce Pascoe and other workers that Aboriginal people really did manipulate and cultivate the land, things through burning, use of sensible fire practices to encourage pastures, and then the native animals like kangaroos, a very traditional and healthy food source, protein. And then, I guess, settlement, so all of a sudden you've got sheep or cows. Aboriginal people may spear to meet their food sources and take some of that sort of European food sources, sheep, cattle, etc., then that would be seen as breaking the law, the LAW, the European law, and so, there's retribution there, and I think it was called martial law. So the impact there of that European invasion was martial law was one thing that Stan Grant spoke about. So shooting Aboriginal people if they're seen to be breaking the European LAW of, engaging in capturing a food source. At the other table there, we've got racism and discrimination. So blatant racism and discrimination. Stan spoke about his grandfather who'd gone and fought for the country in one of the world wars, but he couldn't drink alongside his digger mates at the pub. So it was segregation in a sense. So Aboriginal people were not allowed in towns or pubs or swimming pools. It was the idea of segregation. They're a second-class citizen. So, of course, that psyche or that way of thinking enters the mainstream of Australia, and then, of course, you get all the negative sort of terms, and some of those negative stereotypes are attached to that negative way of thinking. And I guess that infiltrates that racism and discrimination into practices, over-policing, police arresting, being heavy-handed, the European legal system incarcerating a lot of Aboriginal people for, in the broad scheme of things, perhaps fairly minor offences, but in a sense you're getting that institutionalisation. You're forever in a cycle of being in incarceration or boys' homes or girls' training schools, in that removal of children. So in a sense the government practices of removing children for a better way of life or a better education or a better outcome. Really, the better outcome in the end was almost basically slavery, to work as a servant or a farmhand for little or no wages. So that the impact on engagement in that sense would be, again, that mistrust, that why would you engage with the perpetrators of violence, perpetrators of racism? What would be, you would see, what would be the points? Certainly a disillusionment or a disheartenment. Stan Grant spoke about the experience of his grandmother trying to go to the hospital to give birth and being turned away because she was going to give birth to an Aboriginal child. That impact on engagement, again, wariness, racism and discrimination. Aboriginal children started to be excluded from schools. There was policies and procedures embedded, clean, clad and courteous. If an Aboriginal child was deemed as not clean, clad or courteous, removal from education. Of course, in this system, no education, your employment prospects are quite poor. So again, in that racism and discrimination, but getting employment or equal employment is certainly embedded in the philosophy of I'm not going to give a job to an Aboriginal person. In many instances, that would be the thinking. Except perhaps some of those, hard work out on the land, being a jackaroo, being a fencer, those hard work, but again, probably exploited in terms of payment. Past and present power relations. So I guess it's a whole different legal system. It's not LORE, it's law. So the impacts on Aboriginal people has been dispossession, it has been exclusion, and it has been putting into poverty, it has been violence, it has been rape, it has been removal, and it has been total dispossession of culture, identity, full participation, wealth, no treaty, no real acknowledgement in the constitution of it, nothing moving towards a treaty or identifying that Aboriginal people had never said this is your land. So we've got the impact on engagement. So we've got, I guess what we'd say there around the past and present power relations, there we have a lot of engagement in a political sense from Aboriginal people. Activism, whether it be the Freedom Rides from Charles Perkins, trying to raise awareness, to the Black Lives Matters marches. There's that protest movement, Tent Embassy. All those sorts of interactions and engagements is about changing injustices, changing wrongs and being proactive. Again, underneath that, and education, accessing a more appropriate education systems that are more inclusive, and we've got a good little video that will look there. So that's kind of my outlook, and you may have other perspectives and views and things. I certainly haven't covered everything, but there's a little snapshot there. Education, I suppose, willingness to engage in education if you've been excluded, so in that past and present power relations. So question 5, describe your understanding of the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. So we looked at that last week with that map of Australia that's separated into the 500 traditional language groups, or 500 nations if you like. So obviously straight away we can see that Aboriginality, or being an Indigenous person in Australia, is not a one-size-fits-all. It's very complicated. It's very complex. If you're an Indigenous person in Sydney or Newcastle or anywhere, up the coast of New South Wales, your experiences and your law and your customs and, stories of creation, cultural practices, again, and language, traditional language, is going to be slightly different to other parts of Australia. We spoke about, the idea that not just assuming, you got the word Koori. Yeah, Koori was certain parts of New South Wales into Victoria. Then I think we identified Murray up into Queensland, Yolngu up in the Northern Territory, Arnhem Land area, over in Western Australia, Noongar. Just some simple languages, and that, and I guess that shows the difference in language, different in identity, and of course Torres Strait Islander people, different again, and that's where Eddie Mabo came from. We spoke a little bit about Eddie last week, but again a different set of cultural practices in those many islands between the tip of Cape York and New Guinea. So it's not just, you might understand a certain practice from a certain area, but the practice in another area might be different in another. And that could be around ceremony and traditions, even around death, and the naming, up in Arnhem Land and parts of Northern Territory. It's certain practices, not speaking someone's name, and having a respectful kind of process after someone's passed, that it might be slightly different to, say, New South Wales. So, although, sorry business and it can be quite complex and extended family, time-consuming and very important, there could be slight differences in some of those intricacies and those practices, as another example. Let's just have a look at some of the cutaway videos that I looked at. Now, the first one, we've just mentioned about the idea, I spoke about the idea that this assessment, and the fact that that table in question 4 used the word settlement, and there many might say that is indicative that this has been written from a European perspective. If an Aboriginal perspective might use the word invasion, one would suggest. Let's just have a quick look at Briggs and his take on the language. This was from the Charlie Pickering show, The Weekly.
Also making news this week, something that happened hundreds of years ago.
University students are being told it's offensive to suggest Captain Cook discovered Australia. Instead, they're being taught to refer to Australia as being invaded and break the nation's history into pre-invasion and post-invasion.
Was Australia invaded? It's a complicated question worthy of our best historians. Let's ask Wide World of Sport's Ken Sutcliffe.
Colonisation, I think, is probably a fair way to describe it, by and large, because I'm sure when they first settled this country, Captain Cook, they weren't looking at being, the oppressor. They were looking at, hey, we've just discovered this block of land and it's fantastic and we're going to bring a lot more people out here.
Yes! Captain Cook's arrival was more like an episode of The Block. That's why Scott Cam starts every season with a declaration of terra nullius. So it wasn't an invasion?
Everyone was invaded, so get over it. What? Bring me someone that was affected when this happened and we will compensate them. Everyone else, you're full of shit. Just get on with life. It's 200 years ago.
Oh, OK, so it was an invasion, but it was ages ago. Typical history, always dwelling on the past. To settle this, let's fire up the satellite and cross to our Indigenous Australia correspondent, Adam Briggs.
Thanks, Charlie. It's so nice to be the first person to discover your show.
Sorry, Briggsy, we've been doing this for a year now. This is the second season.
Yes, and it was primitive and noble. And now that I've arrived, it can finally be settled.
OK, so Briggsy, can you understand why some people find invasion a little confronting? It's a pretty loaded word.
Yeah, I understand. It's like the word invasion just showed up on your shores one day and forced itself into your vocabulary. And loaded words can hurt, though Not as much as loaded muskets.
OK, but some people have suggested that it technically wasn't Cook that invaded. He just stopped here and then kept on moving.
Yeah, but he was a notorious gatecrasher. He crashed another party in Hawaii, and they gave him a welcome to country at the business end of a spear.
But why shouldn't we just say that Cook discovered Australia?
Because he didn't. Cook wasn't even the first white person here. Your history is so white, you've even whitewashed out the Dutch. Forget the Southern Cross, you should all be getting windmills and clogs.
OK, but is Kyle Sandilands right?
No.
But let me finish. I mean, this was all a long time ago. We can't blame people now for what happened then.
Yes, we can. You're still here. Australia is the worst example of squatters' rights ever. If history was a current affair, you'd be the tenants from hell.
So we should just say invasion then?
Honesty is always the best policy.
Briggs, thanks very much for your thoughts. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Chuck, and I'll see you at the luau.
Give it up for Briggsy!
And following that, let's just have a little look at a segment from The Drum, ABC The Drum, 7th of June 2021. And this is really good segue into the next section. But this is a young Aboriginal woman who studied in Newcastle Uni and is now a lawyer. Let's just hear her experiences of the education system and the university system, and I guess those structures like that you might find in education.
We're talking here about, Brendan brought up the whole thing of ATARs and the pressure of tests and ranks and exams. And your story is so stunning because you say that you didn't pass a single assessment when you were at school and that you were put in a pathways program, right? Because school just didn't work for you. It was a difficult time. Tell us about how, I mean, now you're a lawyer. Tell us about how you moved forward from that pathway of school.
Yeah, so I failed every year 11 and 12 legal studies assessment. And I'm talking every exam, every assessment, essay, you name it, all in legal studies. But I was still determined to go to uni. And Newcastle University ended up reaching out to me and asking, you know, come try this pathways program called YPUG, which is an Awabakal word for pathway. And so I did. And that whole pathways program was shaped around Black academics. And that was a pivotal moment for me. I remember my lecturer finished class early so we could go into town to stop the forced closures of Aboriginal communities, to protest. And I found myself at the front of the protest and I thought, you know what, I am smart enough to do law. And then a year later, you know, at my final year of law school, I ended up topping the class for advanced legal writing and research and going on to write a PhD. So it's been quite a ride.
That's actually amazing. What was it about, like, taking you to the protest? Do you think this was the teacher recognising something in you, or like maybe stitching knowledge and saying, this isn't some abstract thing, this really matters in the world, this is important, this can be a weapon?
Yeah, it was. It was. And there was one case, that same lecturer, Dr. Charlene Leroy-Dyer, I remember submitting an assignment and she looked at it and she said, you know what, Taylor, you can do better than this. And I thought to myself, you know what, I can do better than this. And she let me resubmit, even though it was past the due date. And I went from a credit to a high distinction. And I thought, you know what, I backed myself because I had a teacher that believed in me. Yeah. And I had the same laptop from year 11 when I was given, you know, a scholarship, all the way to my final year of law school.
Yeah. That laptop got you all the way through. Now, Brendan, you were nodding so vigorously when you hear that story. Tell us why.
I just love that story because it highlights the fact that the school system and the way its assessment works isn't always a good indicator of success. And I think Taylor used the word smart when she's sort of thinking, I am smart enough to be a lawyer. And it breaks my heart to think that we have events occurring in schools, for example, maybe not doing well on an essay, that can be so damaging to young people's self-esteem and sense of self, where they think, well, I'm not smart. And I just think it's such a beautiful story for Taylor to have that moment later on with the right mentoring and with the right pathways, where she realised that she could be this version of herself that she aspired to, and that story I'll be telling to my students next week, definitely.
There we go.
And can I just add to that? I think the breaking point, like what really got me through was that Pathways program, which was a free Pathways program, which the Liberal government was going to cut once upon a time, or they were going to cap it for $5,000. And it's that we see a correlation between poverty and education, and if First Nations people and children who experience poverty don't have access to educational pathway programs like this, they will fall through the gaps.
Question 6, explain one way each of the following may influence the delivery of service to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So your own cultural values and beliefs. So we spent a little bit of time exploring, cultural values and beliefs. So, and I guess you see a good snapshot or range in the Briggs stuff on the weekly. So you've got Kyle Sanderlands, his perspective, it's just history, happened a long time ago, doesn't impact anyone. That's a belief, I guess. Whereas Briggs would beg to differ that it's been an ongoing rolling effect of upheaval, change and dispossession. That's intergenerational trauma is a real thing, and I don't believe that Kyle Sanderlands has acknowledged that or understands that. I guess I sort of raised the issue, could I be thinking as a white person that I shouldn't be involved in Indigenous services? However, that was, that might be extreme and ineffective thinking. So it might be that I need to ensure that I work collaboratively and get input and ask from Indigenous people, Indigenous workers, and make sure that I'm really aware and getting good feedback of any biases. Western systems and work practices. So Western systems could be quite inflexible. Things like leave, and I just mentioned earlier that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people may have complex time constraints sometimes around sorry business or funerals, and that might mean travelling away, taking time off. Is that embedded into our leave system? I doubt it. We're quite regimented, perhaps, Western systems. Maybe Western systems are very hierarchical. There's a boss and, there's a lot of policies and procedures and the right way to do it and the right way to write things. Aboriginal people might be more about sharing knowledge, sharing power, and be more collective and be more about doing and talking and interacting. And, the complex nature of some of the paperwork might be seen as secondary importance to actually connecting and working with people, and I can relate to that. However, the way our government works or our funding system works in community services, it might be paperwork first, it almost appears at times. So some of those Western systems are very bureaucratic, often driven by European values, I guess, white middle-aged people, if we think about a lot of the politicians and male as that, and very much about putting values on being the top of the tree, the best, and being the boss and having almighty power. And that may be at odds with doing good work with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. So number 7 is, again, how will you ensure that your awareness of your own cultural bias leads to good work practices? So first point, you've got to just examine any of those biases and whatever they may be, and that's okay, you've got to be honest. But then how do you make sure that you get good practice? So how do you get well informed? Do you talk to elders? Do you get good cultural training? Do you talk to Aboriginal people? Do you talk to Aboriginal services? Do you make sure that you're doing things like, that your service that you're in is doing things like flying the flags, having posters, having elders contribute, plan, things like having a reconciliation action plan. So it's about being informed and continue to develop your education. Hi guys, it's actually another day and I'm having a little think, and I just wanted to revisit that question 4. There's some stuff that I think I could have expanded upon a bit more. I'm not sure how much I touched it on this, but if you looked at the table down there, past and present power relations and the impact on Aboriginal people, I think, yeah, I probably covered that pretty well. And I probably touched upon, the action Aboriginal people in terms of social action, whether it be tent embassy, for example, at Canberra, freedom rides. More recently, with the Uluru Statement of the Heart, I haven't spoken about, but that's about political action and pressure to change things and make things better, make our community and services better. So in that last column around services, one of the impact on the engagement with community services and health system has come about in that Aboriginal people or have developed services specific for themselves, for their own needs and their own people, and I guess that's about trying to overcome some of that stuff that we spoke about earlier in this column, the things like mistrust and abuse, neglect, trauma, all those things that would be the experience of Aboriginal people coming into contact with mainstream services, and whether they be health, education, incarceration, the law, all those sorts of things. So I just wanted to touch upon some of the specific services, and I'm not going to cover everything here for sure, but locally we've got a Wabakal health service, so a service specifically for Aboriginal people in that health space, and they'll look at things like GP, medical, dental, some health sort of stuff, quitting smoking, mental health is noted there. I'm just getting this info off their website. What else we got there? The preschool side of things and playgroups. Housing, it says on the website that they're also there about supporting with housing. So that's a Wabakal in that health space, but broader than that. Another service locally in Newcastle, Mullumbimba Aboriginal Corporation, which is an Aboriginal family service. So again, working with families, but could be parents, children-specific programs, the childcare sort of spaces, and I think they're in the disability sort of side of things too, through the NDIS and linking in and supporting people that way with disabilities. So a broad range of family support services. And I just noted that they got something coming up. This is off their Mullumbimba Facebook page, Trauma Informed Care. So little short course there. Haven't read too much about it, but that idea of intergenerational trauma is something that's really in the forefront of service delivery now, and Aboriginal specific services I think would be well placed to work with Aboriginal people, obviously. Another service is Wandi Ali. So Wandi Ali specialises in that care of children, in particular in out-of-home care. So, for want of a better word, but young children or young people removed from families. But the idea is getting placement and care supported through Wandi Ali with Aboriginal families. So reducing that, I guess, that next generation, or the idea of stolen generation. So the academic thinking at the moment is that we're heading down a poor path in terms of the rate of removal of Aboriginal children and young people from families. Almost, basically another stolen generation in that history there. Legal services specific, so Aboriginal legal services, that one's they're identified at Redfern. I think that's where the Aboriginal service sort of movement started, but there's certainly an office in Newcastle. Another Aboriginal specific service, the Land Council. You might see them around in your area, supporting employment programs. I guess one of the successful ones would be the Warramai up around the Port Stephens area, where they've that whole Stockton Dune system, and doing tours and cultural tours and activities in that space. And they've got quite a big centre there called Marook on the road to Nelson Bay. But locally, just down the road from Belmont at Swansea, you've got the Butterbar local Aboriginal Land Council. I've popped in there with classes in the past, and similar sort of stuff, I guess. Employment programs, training, education, and you might see other names that you're familiar with. Darkinjung would be down around your Wyong and Central Coast area. Wabakal would be, I think, Toronto area. That one would be based, and we've got a Wabakal in Newcastle. So they're the local Aboriginal Land Council. So it's more than just land, it's employment and support as well. Another one I mentioned, the Wallatuka Institute, that supporting Aboriginal students in getting their qualities through the Uni of Newcastle. So a young woman that we saw earlier in this video who'd got her law degree through and supported through Wallatuka and the YPUG program as well. So all these sort of things is about mainstream services, if you like, but with an Aboriginal support and perspective and employment and getting better outcomes and supporting Aboriginal people that way. So that would be another thing that you could put in, that the impact on engagement. So it's become engaging with specifically Aboriginal services. All right, and there's one last little thing, a little bonus little track I'm going to put in. I guess it's not compulsory, but it is something from ABC Radio from 2:18, I believe. Miff Warhorse talking to Mark Holden. People are a bit older. Mark Holden had a bit of a music career. He's also a lawyer, and he was on one of those talent shows a few years ago now in Australia's Got Talent or something like that as a judge. But he's also got connections to, I guess, the entertainment industry broadly, and sounds like more down in that South Australia area, or perhaps Victoria, country Victoria, South Australia, through those performing families. Anyway, he talks a little bit about the history there, and even the naming of a road and things like that. So, you know, giving stories and history a real personal toodle pips.
They were bringing the songs of the day. They were the
radio. Yeah.
Yeah, they were. So there's just something real. I've got some beautiful photographs and that are part of the show. So it's Tall Tales and Songs is the show, and I've got beautiful images. Mervyn Ashton, the Holdens and the Ashtons. The Ashtons are the oldest circus family in the Western world. They're going 9 generations now, and they're in Perth, they're in Queensland, they're different parts of the family all over the place. But Mervyn, who's probably in his 80s now, when in the 1950s, he had a 16mm camera that his dad gave him, and he filmed the circuses, and it's never been seen before. I travelled with him and his family in the 90s when I came back, and a young filmmaker called Amiel Corton Wilson, who was 16 at the time, and I took him on the road with me, and he filmed the stories being told, and they tell the stories of the Holdens and the Ashtons joining forces together in the 1930s, and Mervyn's got this glorious film. He pulled them out from underneath his seat in the caravan and showed me all these magnificent, beautiful films that he took in the 50s, and that's part of the show as well. But it's not just history, although I do touch on the dispossession.
Tell me about that. There's the dark side in the show based around a letter that you found.
Yes, I found a letter from 1870 from John Holden in which he talked about... Now, these people were, Irish Catholic parish farmers who came out from the Troubles and found themselves on the Bellarine Peninsula near Drysdale, and they magically, let's say, acquired, and I'm doing the inverted commas here, the land. And, of course, that land, which was, they cleared and they stripped the land of the native vegetation and they fenced it and they grew wheat and they raised sheep. Well, that was originally the Wathaurong land. And my cousin Marie told me I needed to go down and meet with the Wathaurong, which I did. And I've formed a really, really beautiful bond with them. And I got a great story, a true story from Uncle Dave Tournier, who's unfortunately passed now. And Uncle Dave told us the story of the kill party. And that was that if you drive down into Geelong, if your listeners who are listening in Victoria find themselves driving into Geelong, you'll see a road called Bellpost Hill. And on Bellpost Hill in the 1860s and 1870s, there was just a little humpy, but it had a bell. And what would happen is that when the settlers saw the Wathaurong just walking on their seasonal walk, as they had done for thousands of years, they'd ring the bell and they'd say, "The blacks are coming, the blacks are coming," and they'd send out a kill party. And they literally sent out a kill party, and they just shoot them dead.
Horrific.
So in that letter, he noticed that there were that in 1870 there were no Wathaurong around, and what I've discovered subsequently is that from an original clan between 300 and 600 in first settlement 1850s, by 1870 there were only 7 left.
Oh, that's so tragic.
And we never learnt this myth.
We were never taught, exactly.
Why were you never taught this?
And you learning it through looking at your own history,
Yes.
and you are here, I guess, because of that grim and horrible and incredibly unbelievable history. We're all here.
That's right, but my family profited from it. And my grandfather and his brother were selling those blocks of land after World War I. And so my father could go to Scotch College, So we've inherited this wealth. at the same time as the Wathaurong went from a clan of between 300 and 600 to 7. And the beautiful part about it is that I wrote a song, Kill Party, with Mick Ryan, who I met at the Wathaurong Centre, and Mick's an Indigenous man who's a beautiful singer, great guitar player and a great songwriter. And we put the words that Uncle Dave taught us into a song. And so Mick and I have played this song in a number of places, and we've got to, and there's something profound about, 150 years later, connecting and sharing the story and telling the story and passing the story along, but also just pointing out what was our education, seriously.
Absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly.